Brian O'Driscoll on Off the Ball.
With Vodafone, official sponsors of the Irish rugby team. Team of us. Everyone in.
Good evening and welcome to Friday Night Rugby as we look ahead to another very busy weekend in the Guinness Pro 14. Business end of the season now. We're into the semi-final qualifiers or quarter-finals or whatever you want to call them, because there are only two of them. This Saturday, Munster hosting Benetton. That's at 3 o'clock at Thomond Park. Benetton, the first ever Italian side to get through into the playoff stage of the Pro 12 or 14. And that's followed then 5:35 at Kingspan Stadium by Ulster against Connacht. Those two sides meeting for the third time this season, an Irish derby. Connacht winning both of those, doing the double over Leinster in the league. The first time they would have done the double over Ulster in almost 60 years. Brian O'Driscoll's with me this evening. Evening, Brian.
Good evening. Good evening.
I'm going to start, before we actually talk about the Irish provinces themselves, I think it might be nice to talk about Benetton season and having an Italian side into the quarterfinals, semi-final playoffs, whatever we're going to call them.
It's great, isn't it?
Brilliant for the league.
Yeah.
Brilliant for Italian rugby to have an automatic qualifier in the Champions Cup next season. And we've spoken about Connacht and what they've done this season and how brilliant it's been for them. But I'm sure people outside of Ireland would probably rank what Benetton have done maybe even a little bit higher.
Yeah, I think it's really important for the league. Obviously, you mentioned it's important for Italian rugby. You know, they're going through a sticky patch at the moment for sure. And since the advent of the Champions Cup coming in and automatic qualification not being guaranteed to an Italian team, they've been on the outside. They've been playing Challenge Cup rugby. So to earn the right to play Champions Cup rugby next year is brilliant from their perspective, but it also shows how much they've improved, but how much it's not just Britain and Ireland and a French league, that we can now have an Italian team involved and eating at the top table, but also they could not challenge for a quarter-final spot. They're not going to be there yet, but they're going to cause lots of teams trouble at home, as they have done in the Pro 14 all this season. And even on the road, we saw with their draw against Leinster a few weeks ago, they're not afraid anymore, and they're playing with this new freedom and an expression that you hope will have a knock-on effect to the national team, albeit Conor O'Shea hasn't quite gotten the results he'd been hoping for in the last year.
On that though, like the conference they even had to begin with, Scarlets, who won it 2 years ago, were in the final last year. Edinburgh, who up until probably about a month ago, everyone was saying what a season they're having, getting through to the Heineken Champions Cup quarterfinals, and it looked for a long time like they were going to be in the top three, maybe in that. There was a huge scrap really between themselves, Ulster, Benetton and the Scarlets as well. To finish above them, given the season that so many other people would have been saying that Edinburgh were having, is just a massive result.
Yeah, and Edinburgh seemed to have faltered a small bit towards the end, the latter part of the season, the business part. Maybe, they gave that extra little bit of focus to, their Champions Cup quarter-final and slipped up. They obviously had a big victory against them over in Treviso, where they denied them a losing bonus point as well. And all those small little things, particularly when it's going to be super tight, in that third qualifying slot, all those little one-pointers can give you a real confidence and a real boost. And huge credit to them. They've a pretty impressive squad now. They've got a nice mix of youth and experience, lots of internationals. You look at that Italian team now, and on the team sheet you see it's littered with Benetton players. And then the likes of Ian McKinley coming in, and what a story that is. And even watching some of his social media and his tweets of how much it means for him and for the club to make it into the qualifiers. But you have to also not disrespect them and automatically write them off as their season being over. Yes, it's a huge uphill challenge that they have to go to Thomond Park and try and pick up a victory on the road there, when lots is at stake, and that's where Munster really come into their own. They might slip up occasionally in the regular season, but usually at this stage, they get themselves into quarterfinals, into semi-finals, and occasionally into finals. But you would imagine that Benetton will play the game of their lives, and Munster will have to produce.
Yeah, and we saw it only a few weeks ago when Munster were granted away to Benetton in Italy. They ended up winning 37-28, but for large parts of that game, they were scrambling a lot. They got a couple of tries late on in the second half that made it probably look a bit more comfortable than it was. But watching back at some of it this afternoon, like Ratuva Tabiara on the wing, the Fijian winger, like just absolutely gassing people out the wing, and only a week or two beforehand he got that try late on against Leinster as well, where he left Hugh O'Sullivan diving at thin air with one of the most ridiculous dummies I've seen in years.
It's like watching underage sometimes with some of these Fijians, where it's a little bit of Forrest Gump, is get the ball to the fast guy, where they just have this, obviously brilliant footwork, but this crazy acceleration, and it's, I suppose, part of it is just keeping their interest levels up. They can come in and out of game, but when they do perform, they have real X factor, and he'll be someone that they'll be looking to get the ball to as much as possible. It'll be interesting to see what Munster do as well, and the team that comes up against them. Obviously, JJ Hanrahan is probably the form fit 10 in Munster, and whether he gets the nod ahead of Tyler Bladendoll will be very interesting.
Yeah, how much chance do you give Benetton of causing a shock?
I think it's a big ask. Munster will be wounded from their Champions Cup exit at semi-final. They'll really feel as though they owe Leinster one in a semi-final. Again, a rehash of potentially last season's semi-final, where they came up just 1 point too shy. So I feel as though Munster will have the bit between their teeth, and they'll have too much for this Benetton team. But expect them to concede some points as well, because there is firepower, as we mentioned, and there's scores in that Benetton team, so they won't go down without a fight. But I just think a step too far. But it won't be a cricket score, that's for sure.
Yeah, and you kind of mentioned there like how Munster will be targeting getting to take on Leinster in a potential semi-final. It'll be the week after the Champions Cup final as well, and we would have seen last year when Munster went to the RDS, they got very close. There was clearly a bit of a hangover in there from Leinster's point of view, and I'd say Munster will know that potentially could be there again. There could be the chance to kind of catch them on the hop slightly on a short week after the Champions Cup.
Yes, and they'll be saying that they'll be very focused on the Benetton game. Of course they will, but if they see it through, they then have 2 weeks to prepare for that Leinster semi-final, and that extra week can count for a huge amount when it comes to this part of the season, of being able to do that extra little bit of analysis on an opposition, and just to get yourself prepped physically in the right condition, rest the sore bodies from the quarter-final to then take on what will be a battered and bruised Leinster team. There's no doubt. We saw that in the semi-final last year after their success down in Bilbao. They came back and still had enough, but it certainly wasn't vintage Leinster, and they could have lost it right at the death. So I just wonder, this year with where Munster have been of the course of the last 2 or 3 seasons, that hurt and that disappointment definitely adds up and builds up, and if you channel it in the right way, you could have a huge performance. There's lots of ifs, buts and maybes at the moment, but I think if that does become a semi-final, it'll be a very, very tough game for Leinster, because of those sore bodies and because of the motivation that Munster will have.
On last week's Munster game against Connacht, one man I'd say who wasn't watching the review back with much delight, Andrew Conway. Obviously, it's something that we would have been speaking a lot about post Jacob Stockdale's knock-on against Leinster. Johan van Graan, even after the game, he kind of tried to play it off very much in the, he'll make sure he won't do it again. But you could see he was very, very unhappy about what had happened there.
Yeah.
Like look at...
I saw someone drawing comparisons to Freddie Burns. It's nothing like Freddie Burns, first of all. I also think it's nothing like Jacob Stockdale. Jacob Stockdale has someone challenging him, and he makes an error and doesn't get the ball down, which he'll have been kicking himself, particularly considering how costly that looks to have been. Conway's was slightly different. He wasn't celebrating. He was, cantering in, thinking that the job was done, and in fairness, was it Fitzgerald that managed to chase back and not give up a dead cause. Huge credit to him. And I think sometimes in these circumstances we always pry on the negative of someone not getting the job done. I'd be more inclined to feed the positive of that work rate and that intent to get back and give yourself a chance of stopping a 5 or a 7-pointer as it was going to be. And huge credit to him for doing so. Embarrassing for Conway. Nothing short of embarrassing. Held his hand up, said no excuses. And the best way to put that right is be involved in the next score, which he managed to be for the Mike Haley try. So it's definitely something that would annoy you as a coach, because he's done a great job in reading play. O'Halloran's thrown a blind pass, which you just can't do to a winger that understands systems very well and understands space very well. So it was a great intercept. You just have to accelerate and get that ball down, because a coach over the whitewash, if you're over the whitewash, you need to get it down.
What I was curious about actually watching it at the time as well was, it's obviously something you can't really pick up on TV, but how many Munster players, as Stephen Fitzgerald was gaining on him, were screaming, touch it down, man on, man on.
Well, I was trying to listen to the audio of the crowd, because obviously but also when there's an intercept, there's an initial shout and an excitement where the crowd gets going, and then when so it's hard to differentiate between that and then a heightened excitement or a warning of a player coming up behind you. So I can understand from Conway's point of view that he just thought he was out there on his own, but even still, you only make those mistakes once. I'm sure Freddie Burns won't make that mistake again, Jacob Stockdale won't make that mistake again, and you can be sure Andrew Conway won't make that mistake again. But wasn't costly for them. I did laugh as I was watching the game and flicked through social media and saw Simon Zebo's post of his gif of Michael Jordan crying and laughing at the same time with no words underneath. I just thought that was perfectly timed and hit the mark. I think the fact that the game was it was still in the balance towards it was 5-6 minutes to go. I'm sure Conway was probably quite nervous, but it's easier to to take those when it hasn't cost you the game, that's for sure.
Win, lose or draw this weekend. Johan van Graan has kind of hinted in the last week that he's probably going to look to make an addition to the coaching staff in the off season, looking like an attack coach as well. I think it's something that for the last month or even a few months that most people are probably saying is probably what Munster need.
Yeah, it does feel as though it's the missing component of their game. I don't think it's solely, the focus could be put on the likes of Felix Jones, who was doing backs and attack, and whether he wasn't inventive enough. I think you have to look at the players that are responsible for that attack game as well. And I look at Munster over the course of the last few seasons, the last 3 seasons. I think they were very lucky to get into the Champions Cup semi-final 3 years ago. They were worthy of it last year, albeit they got torn apart by Racing, and they were probably quite fortunate to find their way in there again this time round, where Edinburgh probably should have been able to see the game through, but then just showed the gulf in class between quarterfinals and semi-finals when you're playing the opposition of the likes of Saracens and even Leinster in the Pro 14. So I don't think it's solely an attack game or a defensive game. I think a bit of player responsibility to up their performance and up the standard across the board. And they've definitely got some world-class players, but do they have enough of them to compete for honours consistently and get into finals? I think they're just falling short of that. And
if you were to bring in one big signing into that squad, where would you be looking to bring it in? And obviously then as well, is there the budget for it? And if not, what do you do then?
I still think if you look at the comparisons of certain front rows, the tight five is where games are won and lost. And I just look at the Saracens tight five versus Munster. You look at the 2 second rows. You got Maro Toji and George Cruz, with Skelton to be able to come off the bench, and then Mako, Jamie George, and I think even Vincent Koch was on the bench. So someone that
Skelton and Koch came on at the same time.
So if you look at that's international standards. There's 4 English internationals. I think if you look at the Munster tight five, I just feel, even with the addition of Tadhg, I just feel as though teams think that they can get after them there when it comes to the business end of the season. And you look, they've got very talented backs, great half-back pairing when Joey and Connor are fit. A great back row, nice balance. Still remain a little bit unconvinced at 7 what their best option there is. But I just feel as though they still need a little bit of improvement in the tight five there to compete at European level year on year.
Okay.
Sorry, and I mean, obviously they're competing, but I mean progressing beyond that semi-final.
To get into that Leinster Saracens tier.
Yeah. I think those two are on their own. Racing are slightly below them. Toulouse coming up, and then kind of Munster are in at that Toulouse level right now.
Okay, time to move on to Ulster against Connacht then. That is this Saturday, tomorrow at 5:35. Just a reminder as well, our rugby coverage is brought to you by Vodafone. Team of us, everyone in. Now, Brian, Connacht's 2 wins against Ulster this season, including one at Kingspan Stadium where the game is tomorrow. They do look very, very evenly matched.
Yeah, I think that's a difficult game to call. Coaches tend not to put a whole lot of focus on what's happened that season when they're looking, forward to a third game against the same opposition. But I do think the first win in Kingspan for 60 odd years, was it 1960? I think was their last victory.
It was, yeah.
Up there. So that is, for me, is absolutely something to build on, something to remind yourself that it's a hurdle you've gotten over, and quite recently, so nothing to be feared. Those things can fester away in the background sometimes when a game goes against you. It's like, well, we haven't won here in 60 years. But when you have done recently and it might get away from you, it's just a small little 1%. You go, do you know what? We managed to turn something around. We were here 3-4 months ago and we managed to get a good result. So there's nothing to be afraid of. And I think that the confidence that this Connacht team are playing with at the moment, the brand of rugby that they're playing, their set piece, particularly their scrum right now, are definitely going to cause Ulster some problems. So it's just a matter, can they deal with the attacking weapons that Ulster have shown in the last number of weeks? And in fairness to them, they've put in some big performances too. Their performance over in Edinburgh was a colossal result, particularly coming off the back of the disappointment of their Champions Cup quarter-final. So to get to this stage, where they were less than a year ago, they would be very pleased to have qualified for Champions Cup rugby for next year. But now they'll feel as though a semi-final is the very least that they would expect.
It actually kind of feels, I think anyway, that game in Kingspan Stadium back in, I think it was October.
Yeah.
It kind of feels like that was the making of both of these sides. For Connacht, they had a few wins and a few defeats in those first few games under Andy Friend, and that gave them the confidence to push on for the rest of the season, and you can see the way they've carried on. For Ulster, I remember afterwards Dan McFarlane was talking about how they were beaten up, they were bullied, their scrum was absolutely decimated, they lost all 3 of their put-ins. I saw a stat there last week from Opta. Since then, Ulster have won 89 of 90 scrums on their own feet, up to and including the game against Leinster last week. So they obviously learned a lot from that game as well.
Yeah, and sometimes listen, you've got to use different scenarios for different motivation. And from Connacht's perspective, even though they didn't always get the results they were looking for in the very early parts of the season, you could sense immediately that they were a team that had grown massively from last year. Even I was unbelievably impressed watching early games with some of their launch plays off scrum and line out, just the lines of running, the intent of the players that weren't getting the ball. And I think that's a big, for me, that's a big selling point as to whether a team is invested or not, as to whether people are willing to run as hard as decoys as they are when they're getting the ball. And you could sense that they were cutting teams open, even though they weren't always finishing their line breaks. They were cutting teams open with some pretty scintillating play, and now they've built on that and the confidence of getting victories and getting some victories on the road as well, and building the team. You have to remember too, it's Andy Friend's first season, and it feels as though we're back to the Pat Lam, but there's an extra added emphasis on certain parts of their game. Like I said, their set piece. I think the strength and depth is much better. You look at the team that went out at the weekend.
You mentioned strength and depth. They've used 50 players this season. And, week on week, we're constantly talking about Leinster. They've used 57. It's amazing. It shows the depth. Like, Connacht have got to this stage of the season using 50 players. There's not a lot of teams out there that have used that many. There
certainly aren't. And, a lot of squads wouldn't have. Even some, squads in England wouldn't have 50 players with academies included. So you look at those academy players that are now breaking through as well. And there's been a lot of focus put into that. And yes, maybe they've gone to Leinster or to other provinces to try and pick and choose the players that weren't contracted by those provinces, but you have to find people that will fit your setup as well. We obviously saw Dean coming on for first cap at the weekend and doing particularly well. Looked very comfortable, looked very confident. You wouldn't have thought that it was his debut. It was he a 21-year-old? Missed a goal or two, but other than that, a very well-rounded performance. So to be able to bring those players through and marry them with the big names, with their profile, names, the Quinn Roos and the Bundyakis, and obviously Jack Carty playing a terrific season as well.
He's just kind of epitomised the way Connacht have gone this season as well. It's kind of mirroring what Andy Friend is doing, kind of just in Carty.
And sometimes, when a key player gets on really well with the coach, you see them thrive. And it almost feels as though you see it with Johnny Sexton and Joe Schmidt. It's almost like his general out there. It's his voice out there. And I wonder, is there a little bit of that? Is there a great relationship between the two? You can see it with Johan van Graan and Joey Carbery, that there's a tightness there and there's a friendship there. And I just wonder, is there a bond between those two, because he's going out and playing with the freedom of a proper footballer. And I didn't realise, just reading an article in the Irish Times today about him getting trials for Southampton under 15s and having his bag packed, but then them not being able to take overseas players, and he never actually got the opportunity. So he obviously was a very talented footballer, and that's clear to see in the way he plays the game. He plays really plays great heads up in the defeat in the RDS earlier in the year. He was man of the match performance when they lost, in the 83rd or 84th minute. But that try that he scored, and his ability to understand where the space is. There aren't that many 10s out there with that level of vision, and there was always a couple of question marks about goal kicking and about kicking out of hand. But I think those parts of his games have really come on. His game management has really come on. So he's fully deserving of that third out half berth in the Irish setup at the moment, albeit Ross Byrne is doing his very best to breathe down his neck.
He was also nominated as well this week, worth mentioning, for the Zurich Players Player of the Year award, alongside Peter O'Mahony, James Ryan and Tadhg Byrne in that. Before we make a quick word on Ulster, where would you be going on that quartet?
I don't know. I don't know. I know Peter O'Mahony got the Munster Players Award down there. James Ryan's just picked it up in Leinster. Tadhg Byrne for me has been very good in every game that I've watched him play. But yeah, Jack has had a real standout season. I really think you could give it to anyone. I think consistency of performance, I've been incredibly impressed with James Ryan, but it's been much the same as last year. I'd almost be inclined to give it to someone like Jack Carty on the back of such an improved performance and where he was. And I like the idea that there's a lot of pressure being put on someone, and how do they react? Well, when you react as positively as he has done, I think it's important to merit those individuals and to single them out. So I'm really interested to see what does come of it, because he's definitely a worthy recipient the way he's upped his performance this year.
On Ulster, Dan McFarland, they are, some would say, probably in bonus territory at the moment, considering the season they had on the pitch and off the pitch last year. To be coming in now, qualified for Europe for Dan McFarland's first season, in the playoffs for the Pro 14, got some good recruitment in, Jack McGrath coming in next season as well. All of a sudden things are looking very, very good for them going forward. What has he done, do you think?
It's hard to know. I think it is. They're definitely in bonus territory. I think coming into the season, particularly the fact that they didn't have Dan McFarlane for pre-season.
Yeah.
The way he's come in and modified. Obviously, Simon Easterby came in as an interim coach for a while, and then it's very difficult when you don't have a full pre-season to implement all your policies and all your game plan. Also. Jared Payne, did he come in, at the start of pre-season?
Yeah.
I'm not entirely sure. So even his ability to be able to, link up with his coaching staff and fully understand as to how they wants to play out the full season, I think huge credit to Dan for managing to get Ulster playing a particular style, as they have done, managing to push them as hard, push Leinster as hard as they did in the Champions Cup quarter-final, and had Leinster very nervous. So I definitely think, I wouldn't say they've overachieved. I think they'll be very pleased with their season because they've set themselves up for another big year, and they'll have grown in confidence this year too. They will be losing Rory Best next year, which is a big player to replace and a big personality to replace. But
how much is that actually going to impact tomorrow's game and the atmosphere around it and the pressure around it as well? Well,
the hope is that Rory manages to to make the pitch, and he's clearly not 100% fit. When you see the coach saying, "Oh, Rory's back at training this week," you sense that you don't have a full recovery in that short period of time. Particularly if he wasn't able to play any part last weekend to get a bit of game time. So even a 70% fit Rory Best will want to play. He'll play on pure adrenaline, and knowing how tough he is, he'll be able to see his way through the game and navigate his way through it. But I think for everyone associated, not just Rory Best, but for the crowd, to be able to give him a proper send-off from the Kingspan is very important. A servant of 14 or 15 years that's delivered time and again, who's obviously now the club captain again, and also the national captain. I think these are important moments for clubs to be able to appreciate one of their own, and I certainly hope it works out for them in getting the day and the performance that they'd expect.
Pick a winner, and if whoever comes through it, how do they stack up against Glasgow away from home in a semi-final?
I think they'll find it tough against Glasgow. Glasgow at home are, they showed against Edinburgh last weekend. They're pretty potent. Playing in Scotstoun on that 4G pitch, they fast, frenetic, have a lot of energy. They have a lot of players, some just coming back from injury as well. So I think whoever does qualify will find it very tough over there. And Glasgow obviously have the added incentive of knowing that the final is in Celtic Park this year as well, so they won't have to travel too far. So you feel as though if you're beating Glasgow, you're obviously going to. I think if you're beating Glasgow, you're going to win the trophy. I don't know. It's a difficult one to call between Ulster and Connacht. I fancy Ulster probably just to edge it, but I wouldn't be shocked with a third victory for Connacht this season. Because again, they're in freebie territory. They're delighted with what they've achieved, so the shackles are off. But in many ways, they are for both teams. But a little bit less pressure on Connacht to get into a semi-final. But I think there'll be nothing in a score, like one-score game between the two. So I'll just edge it with Ulster, but I really, that's with huge uncertainty.
Finally, before we go, something that's come up in the last few days: more winds of change in Welsh rugby. Sean Edwards is the latest that's going to be off the Welsh coaching ticket when Warren Gatland leaves after the World Cup as well. Robin McBride, as we know, is joining Leinster. This is something that a few days ago Warren Gatland made a point of saying the uncertainty is kind of annoying him a little bit. No surprise that within a couple of days the decision's made and Sean Edwards is leaving. Where does he go next, do you wonder?
I don't know. There's no shortage of suitors. Obviously, it was well documented that Wigan were interested in having him post World Cup, and Wasps threw their hat in the ring as well to sign him up. He obviously has had huge success with them. It's a long stint that he's done with Wales, so I suppose in many ways it's not a great shock to find him moving on. but he brings a certainty to the defensive systems that he's involved in, and he's passionate. Having been coached by him in the Leinster in 2009 and 13, he is very, very passionate about how his defence does. At times you almost laugh thinking he doesn't care about the attack at all, provided his defence gets their act together. But bringing that steeliness and that hunger and appetite to a defence is a really good foundation for building blocks of any side. So a team that wants to step up to the next level, get to a semi-final or a final, could use him, as well as a team that are trying to build from potential relegation or also rans to a team that push into playoff recognition. So I think he will fit all billings. It's whether he wants a head coach job or...
There's talk of an assistant role with France. Knowing the personality he is, could you imagine him dealing with the French attitude to rugby?
I think that would be something that I would like to be a fly on the wall for, because he's quite abrupt and not has a gruffness to him, but I suppose his manner, I think it would be, from my understanding of how the French game works versus what I've seen as his coaching style, I think it would be counterintuitive to try and marry the two of them. The language barrier is obviously going to be an issue, so it's bold of France, but it'll be interesting to see what comes. Maybe he'll keep his powder dry for post World Cup, and maybe he'll join Warren Gatland in England. Who knows? But it's very interesting times ahead, and because there's lots of change and they're breaking up of that coaching ticket that's had huge success, Rob Howley included. But I think it's a great coup for Leinster to get Robin McBride, who's obviously done a really good job there too. And the loss of John Fogarty, it feels as though that's a strong coaching ticket that Leinster have managed to get themselves as well.
Okay, we're out of time for now, Brian. Thanks for coming in.
Neil.
And that's it for Friday Night Rugby.
Brian O'Driscoll on Off the Ball.
With Vodafone, official sponsors of the Irish rugby team. Team of us, everyone in.